Middle-earth had two Dark Lords. The first was Melkor, more commonly known as Morgoth, and the second was his right-hand man, Sauron, who had become a Dark Lord in his own right after Morgoth's defeat. But interestingly enough, behind all the death and destruction, Morgoth and Sauron were not the same. Their motivations, the way they operated, and their ultimate goals were fundamentally different. So in this video, let's explore. How were Morgoth and Sauron different? First, a bit of background, just so we're all on the same page. Morgoth was the OG Dark Lord. He was once the foremost of the Valar, alongside his brother Manwë, and during the early days of Arda, he was by far the most powerful. On the other hand, Sauron was a Maia, a tier below the Valar, and he was originally a servant of the Valar called Aule. In the early days of Arda, he was corrupted by Morgoth and would go on to become one of his most important lieutenants and ultimately his successor. Morgoth would be the Dark Lord of the First Age. Amongst his greatest crimes were the destruction of the two lamps, the destruction of the two trees, the theft of the Silmarils, the cursing of Hurin and his children, and the near-total genocide of the peoples of Beleriand. Sauron would take over his master's mantle in the middle of the Second Age and wear it until the end of the Third Age. Amongst his greatest crimes were the distribution of the accursed rings of power, the destruction of Eregion, the downfall of Númenor, the genocide of the Entwives, and the millennia-long war he waged on the free peoples of Middle-earth. Together, the two Dark Lords had a kill count that likely stood in the millions, and were responsible for destruction that would reshape the world. But despite all of this, Morgoth and Sauron were not the same flavour of evil, not that it really mattered to all the people they killed or enslaved. In fact, if Sauron had just been a little less extreme, it's possible that he would have been one of Morgoth's greatest foes. To understand this, we need to know what motivated them. Morgoth is quite simple to understand. His descent into evil comes from his desire to create true life, something only Ilúvatar was capable of. During the creation of Arda, Morgoth attempts to subvert Ilúvatar, because he wants to do things his own way. When Ilúvatar lays the smackdown on him and tells him that everything he does is part of his plan anyway, Morgoth becomes a little bit upset. His motivation becomes very basic. If it isn't mine, then I'll destroy it. And that's exactly what he does, becoming increasingly extreme over time. In that sense, Morgoth is pure chaos. All the death and destruction he causes is because he's having a giant temper tantrum. Yes, Morgoth is just a big baby. Sauron is a little more complex. Unlike Morgoth, Sauron actually had some good qualities in the beginning. He was an incredible craftsman, he loved order and efficiency, and hated the wastefulness of chaos. Unfortunately, these qualities were also his downfall. His love of order transformed into an obsession, and he deluded himself into believing that things would be better off if he was in control, even if it came at the expense of other living creatures. This is what allowed him to be corrupted by Morgoth. With the Valar, there was plenty of red tape involved. But under Morgoth, Sauron had a lot more free agency to do things the way he wanted. It seems Morgoth recognised Sauron's talent and usefulness, hence why Sauron was appointed as the first commander of Angband. So even from their motivations alone, we can see the massive differences between Morgoth and Sauron. Morgoth was pure chaos, Sauron was tyrannical order. We can see more examples of this in the way in which they operated. Morgoth behaved like an agent of chaos. He hated elves, he hated men, he hated dwarves, he hated everything. His prime motivation was to deal death and destruction to his enemies, which was almost everyone in existence, meaning that his behaviour and actions were often irrational and without reasonable cause. For example, instead of immediately fleeing Valinor, he risked capture by stealing the Silmarils and murdering Finwë, largely just because he hated Feanor. Another perfect example of how spiteful Morgoth was is his treatment of the Easterlings. Despite faithfully serving him in battle, he immediately goes back on his promise of giving them Beleriand, and instead locks them in Hithlum. Treating your allies like garbage seems crazy, but to Morgoth it made sense. Men were a creation of Ilúvatar, and he hated that, so even though they served him loyally, he still hated them. Morgoth's spitefulness would sometimes have unexpected and unintended consequences. The biggest one was his aforementioned murder of Finwë and the theft of the Silmarils, which led to the Noldor following him and engaging him in a 600-year-long war. Morgoth was genuinely surprised by this, which goes to show that he never even thought about the consequences of his actions, and did it just because he knew it would cause people pain. Going back to the example of men, even though they bowed down to him, he still brutalized them, leading to some of them rebelling and becoming the Edain. In these ways, Morgoth, through his destructive but careless actions, was the architect of his own downfall. Morgoth was very aggressive in his style of warfare, preferring blitzkrieg-like assaults on unsuspecting foes. This led to him suffering several catastrophic defeats before he actually started to properly plan things out, but even then, his armies mostly just relied on overwhelming force and destructive power. That's not to say it wasn't effective. Morgoth was never defeated conventionally, and his defeats came as a result of the direct intervention from the Valar. Except for his duel with Fingolfin, Morgoth was almost never physically present at the war, and conducted his wars from deep within Angband. For all his power, he was still a coward. Sauron's behaviour was much easier to understand from the perspective of his enemies. Because he wanted to rule the world and everything in it, destruction was not a necessity, but an option to be used when required, which was a lot. A perfect example is the forging of the Rings of Power. Sauron wanted to use them to gain control of the elves, and he only decided to destroy them after they became aware of his treachery and refused to treat with him. Sauron did not hate elves or men by default, but if you resisted him, then you would serve no purpose in his idea of a perfectly ordered world, and he would go to great lengths to destroy you. Keeping in line with his somewhat saner motivations, Sauron was very calculating, and his actions were very deliberate. He was a skilled planner, and never really acted irrationally, as it went against his core beliefs. Whilst he was certainly also full of spite and hatred, he did not operate solely from the depths of these emotions, and had the good sense to hide it if he was in the process of carrying out a plan. Even his most heinous deeds were done with a greater plan in mind. His destruction of the Entwives was to deny the Last Alliance a place to rest and resupply during their march to Mordor. Sauron was extremely cautious in his approach to warfare, and often took centuries to plan out his invasions, even if it meant giving his foes ample time to prepare defences. His strategies often involved wars on multiple fronts, and he would exploit every advantage to make his foes weaker. This yielded mixed results. Although Sauron would often win battles, he would rarely win the actual war itself. Unlike Morgoth, Sauron was not a coward, and sometimes personally led his armies and would fight if required. However, Sauron was not a fighter, and his record ended up being 0-2 in physical combat. That being said, Morgoth and Sauron still had plenty of similarities in regards to their methods. They both caused death and destruction on a massive scale. They both industrialized their war machine with the liberal usage of slavery, and they both took glee in corrupting or dominating their former enemies. They were both extremely cunning, and knew the best ways to exploit their enemies. There's two perfect examples of this from the First Age. Morgoth ordering the execution of Gelmir in front of his brother Gwyndor to bait Fingon's army into attacking prematurely during the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, and Sauron tricking Gorlim the Unhappy into revealing the location of Barahir and his outlaws, with the promise of reuniting Gorlim with his wife, even though she was dead. They also suffered the same flaws. Both had a certain level of delusion, and both of them were highly ignorant of the nature of good, leading them both to fundamentally misunderstand their enemies, even becoming fearful of them and saddled by doubt. Both of them also poured much of their native power into physical objects. Morgoth poured his power into Arda itself, and Sauron poured his power into the One Ring. Ironically, this led to both of their destructions. Morgoth was pathetic and weak by the end, and Sauron followed the One Ring into oblivion. Interestingly enough, Sauron became more like Morgoth as time progressed, and although his motivations never became as twisted as Morgoth's, his fearfulness and ignorance certainly did. Keeping with the theme of death and destruction, Morgoth's ultimate goal for the world was destruction. Yes, simply destruction. Tolkien outlines this in a passage called Myths Transformed, in Morgoth's Ring. He explains that Morgoth became increasingly irrational and increasingly enraged at the mere existence of life other than himself. Thus, Tolkien concluded that after destroying all of his enemies, Morgoth would even begin to destroy his own creatures and servants. Once that was finished, he would begin attempting to undo all of creation itself, which leads to an amusing mental image where Morgoth is just walking around screaming in rage as he desperately tries to break mountains with his hammer. However, Tolkien points out that this was beyond Morgoth's power. Although he could destroy physical bodies, he could not destroy the spirits of his foes. Thus, they would always exist in one form or another. This is a throwback to the original reason why Morgoth fell to evil. While he could influence matter, he could not truly create it or destroy it. And in regards to Arda itself, although Morgoth could severely damage it, he ultimately could not destroy it, and it would always exist. A world in potential, even if all was ruined and mad. In that sense, Morgoth was not capable of true victory, nor true satisfaction. For him, that ended up becoming the destruction of existence, but that was beyond his capabilities. In the same passage, we also get to understand Sauron's endgame. Unlike Morgoth, the existence of creatures other than himself never offended Sauron, even as Sauron became increasingly like Morgoth as time progressed. In fact, Sauron was fine with the existence of others, provided that they submitted to his will and became part of his dominion. We see this through much of the Second and Third Age, where large sections of Middle-earth are under Sauron's control. However, those that resisted his will were only fit for destruction, hence Sauron waging war against the Westlands of Middle-earth for thousands of years. So unlike in a timeline where Morgoth wins, life and civilization would still exist under Sauron, but that's not to say that it would be great either. We've seen what happens to societies that fall beneath Sauron's influence. People become cruel and greedy, violence becomes normalized, abhorrent practices such as slavery are allowed to occur, and in one example, Numenor, even human sacrifices carried out. Nature would be destroyed, forests cut down to fuel the fires, mountains hollowed out for metal, animals driven to extinction to feed the armies, and rivers polluted from the wastes of the furnaces. And without divine intervention, this dystopian nightmare would be eternal, because as a demigod himself, Sauron has no natural expiry date. A fitting quote for a world beneath Sauron comes from George Orwell's 1984. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face, forever. So, as you can see, Morgoth and Sauron were similar in many ways. Both were evil creatures of incredible power, brutal in their methods, expansive in the scale of their destruction, and they delighted in the demise of their foes. However, they were also different in many ways. They both operated in completely different styles, they differed in the treatment of their friends and foes, and they had completely different thought processes. And most importantly, whereas Morgoth was chaos, Sauron was order. Whereas Morgoth desired destruction, Sauron desired dominion. And in the end, they both ended up in the same place. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. I've been wanting to do this video for a long time, but it's a surprisingly difficult topic to talk about, especially if I want to keep the video to a reasonable length. In reality, an entire video essay could be done on the differences between Morgoth and Sauron, but I wanted to keep it brief. Cheers, thanks again, and remember, don't let people define you just because you're evil. You're your own person, and you deserve to be treated that way.